Thank you, Doron. Thank you, everyone. And welcome to the NLI Reading Room International Events. This evening, we are pleased to launch a series of outstanding archives in the National Library, a series which will give you a glance, which will enable us to expose you to some of our collections, some of our treasures in the archives. Archives department in the National Library consists of more than 1,000 personal archives and collection. Each of them obviously tells a different story of a different figures. And I'm talking about great writers, poets, thinkers, philosophers, society leaders, revolutionaries or conformists, and different scholars who strongly, each of them strongly impacted the society, the culture, the spiritual lives in many different ways. So we're going to begin today with a lecture of Hanan Harif, Dr. Hanan Harif, about Professor Shlomo Dov Goitein. Then next week, we're going to have a short break for 1 week due to Shavuot holiday. We're going to come back in 2 weeks' time, on the 23rd, with a lecture of Guy Raz, who's going to lecture about the archive of Aliza Orbach, the photographer Aliza Orbach. A week later, on the 30th of May, Dr. Andrea Gondos will lecture about the archive of Yeshayahu Tishby, the Kabbalist scholar. And then the last lecture on the 6th of June belongs to Gary Wexler, a very famous copywriter and advertiser in the USA in the last few decades, who donated his personal collection to the National Library. So as you can see, as you can figure out, we have a very variety of the archival collections, of our archival collection, which involves historical aspects, visual aspects, like photographs, modern Jewish lives. And this is only one, only 4 lectures, but gives you some aspect of the archival collections in the National Library. So today we have the honor and the pleasure to host Dr. Hanan Harif. Hanan is a scholar, is a researcher who actually transformed into an archivist. A few years ago, he spent, I think, about 1 year or 2 years in the archives, in our archives department. In these 2 years, I think he went through every single paper and letter and every document that Shlomo Dov Goitein wrote and thought. And I think you really have a very good vision of this great man called Professor Shlomo Dov Goitein. I must admit, I didn't really hear of Shlomo Dov Goitein before I met Hanan, before I came to the National Library, and I exposed to his extraordinary personality thanks to Hanan. Archives department, we meet all the time great personalities, but Goitein is definitely one of the giants due to his wide variety of disciplines as a researcher of the Yemenites, of the Cairo-Geniza, as an educator in the British Mandate, due to his beauty and poetic way of expression, the way he expresses himself in his letters, in his diaries, his sensitivity to people of all kinds, to phenomenons. And I think everyone who meets him through the archive really meets a scholar which stands in the very first line of the scholars, of the Jewish scholars in the 20th century. So this was a very short exposition. I don't think that 45 minutes will be enough to speak about Goitein, but let's give it a try, Hanan, and the stage is yours.
Okay, so many thanks, Matan, for this introduction, and thank you, Doron, for organizing the whole event. And thank you, everyone, for being here and viewing me and talking about my really, as Matan said, one of my habits, one of my maybe my biggest occupation during the recent years. Shlomo Dov Goitein, his archive, his life. Actually, I'm writing his biography in these days, and I would like to start after this general introduction by Matan. I'd like to start with the very basic concept of an archive. So as we all know, an archive tells a story. Each archive has its own story. And normally, needless to say, it is the story of its creator, its owner. But in some cases, archives also tell a broader story. I mean, the story or a story about their time and places. And I think that Goitein's archive, Shlomo Dov Goitein's archive, is indeed a source not only for his own life, for a specific life, but as we will see shortly, it is also a source for broader phenomenon which characterized the life of the Jewish people in the 20th century. So, in order to open and give a broad view of this figure, I would like to share my screen now, and I hope that you all see my presentation. Do you?
Yes, we do.
Okay, wonderful. So, wait a second, I have to move your, yeah, okay, there you go. So, right now we see two pictures of Goitein. One of them was a very, very nice picture. It was chosen by the library to publish this lecture, and the other one, and of course, as you can see, can all see, it is from his later life. I don't know, maybe during the 60s or 70s, 1970s. An elderly scholar writing and dealing with his research, and on the other picture here to the right side of the screen, you could see Goitein, the young Goitein, with his Hebrew signature, and this picture was taken in 1923. I didn't mention, but it is very convenient to deal with his life, because he was born in the year of 1900. So it is very easy if I say 1960s. I know he was in his 60s, etc. And here he is a young man giving a talk to his friends in the Blau-Weiß youth movement in Germany in 1923, shortly before his immigration to the land of Israel. And we will touch upon this point right away. So, a few words about the fields in which he dealt. So first of all, as I guess most of you know, he was a scholar of the Cairo-Geniza. So the Geniza is a place where holy scriptures, and in earlier times also any scripture written in Hebrew letters were kept. So Cairo-Geniza is a treasure of hundreds of thousands of Hebrew or Judeo-Arabic, mainly Judeo-Arabic, but also Hebrew and other languages written in Hebrew letters, and also some other kinds of documents. We'll talk about it a little bit later. However, he's mostly known for being the doyen of the Cairo-Geniza scholarship, but it was not his only occupation. So I will just browse very briefly on his fields of study and activity. So he was a scholar, also a groundbreaking scholar of Yemenite Jews, Yemenite Jewry. His initial study was Islam, the Qur'an. So his PhD was written in Frankfurt in the early 1920s on the prayer in the Qur'an. Furthermore, Goitein was very much concerned with the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, I mean. So wrote as a scholar and as an educator about the Bible, and a whole book, for instance, about how to teach the Bible, Hebrew book, which brings me here to the question of Jewish education, which occupied Goitein throughout his life as a Zionist, a devoted Zionist. Throughout his life, he was very busy in questions of the future of the people of Israel, of the Jewish people, and also of the state of Israel, and we will touch upon this point right away. And it also has much to do with the question of Arab-Jewish relations, and another field of occupation as a scholar and as an educator, and also as a public intellectual, the question of Hebrew language, how to speak Hebrew, how to teach Hebrew, also how to teach Arabic. All these fields were very, very important for Goitein, and he really devoted his life to these many fields, and it also had some impact on his, or huge impact actually, on the course of his own life, or his biography. So a very brief survey of his biography. Born in Germany, in Bavaria, a small town named Burkenstadt in 1900, as I said. At the age of 1914, moved to Frankfurt with his family after his father's death, living in Frankfurt about a decade, and very devoting his time, first of all, until the first 4 years, he was a student, a gymnasium student, and later he was during the last half a year of the World War I. He joined the German army, served half a year, and in 1918 moved to the University of Frankfurt, and as a student he was released from service, and as I said, studying Islamic studies and also classical studies in Frankfurt University, Goethe University in Frankfurt. But not only academic life for Goitein during these years. At the same time, I'm talking about the post-World War I Frankfurt and early Weimar Republic. He was very busy also in what I called here Jewish studies. I meant not in the academic sense of Jewish studies, but in the sense of a religious study. So he was very busy with the Talmud. He describes how much energy and time he spent studying Talmud with various figures within Frankfurt rabbinical community and Orthodox community, and also very active, again, as I said before, very active in Zionist activity, in youth movement, the Blau-Weiß, the blue-white youth movement, and also in the Young Mizrahi movement, also a religious youth movement, a religious Zionist youth movement. So all these until 1923, when he moved to the mandatory Palestine, the land of Israel, spending first 4 years in Haifa as an educator in the Reali school, the Beit HaSefer Reali Ha'ivri, the Reali school in Haifa for 4 years until 1927, when he moved to Jerusalem after a short break in Germany and joined the Hebrew University, joined the new established School of Oriental Studies, which was headed by his doctorate, by his doctorate supervisor, Professor Yosef Horowitz of Frankfurt. So in Jerusalem, Goitein lived for 30 years between 1928 and 1957, and as you can see here, also spent some time also in places like Hungary, Yemen, and we'll talk about it a bit later. And the third part of his life, of his biography, was his American period. And after he moved to the United States in 1957, first living in Philadelphia and working as a professor of Arabic in the University of Pennsylvania until 1970, and in 1971, after becoming a very well-known scholar and recognized, after his scholarship was recognized by could say all the experts in medieval studies, he was invited to the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton, where he lived until his death in 1985. So this is a survey of Goitein's life, and just to give you a very, very brief illustration of his work. So we could, what we see here is his first publication, Pulserina. We'll talk about it in a minute, and later his titles about the Yemenite Jews, and then his work on Muslim history and other related issues. Here, 2 books about the spoken Hebrew and the way to speak Hebrew, Jews and Arabs, his popular research about the contact between Jews and Arabs across the ages, which was published various times during from 1950s until the first decade of the 21st century. One of his biblical studies here, Yunim Bamikra, and of course, this is a selection of some of his books about the Cairo-Geniza and his magnum opus, A Mediterranean Society, his rich description of Jewish life under Islam in the so-called time of the Geniza, more or less between the 10th and the 13th centuries. So this is a very brief illustration of his scholarly activities. I could say that I can say also that his papers count to, I don't know, about 800 or so. So I cannot give them here, of course. So there's another one about the land of Israel in the beginning of Islam and in the Crusaders era. So when I started the work, I felt a little bit like this guy, Shlomo Zalman Schechter. So, Salomon Schechter is very well known for being the British scholar who actually brought most of the Geniza to Cambridge, and also other parts found their way to other places around the world. And of course, what we see here is Schechter sitting in Cambridge and trying to figure out what to do with all that. Of course, I did not have such an experience, but sometimes I felt a little bit like Schechter, because some of the materials, and especially the earlier materials, unsurprisingly, were in a very unorganized condition. So I felt myself maybe I aspired to be also a Geniza scholar for a while. But now I'm again a biographer of a 20th century scholar. So just a few examples for the treasures of this archive. So first of all, you can see here in front of you Goitein's opening page, title page of his PhD dissertation, Das Gebet in Qur'an, the prayer in the Qur'an, and it was submitted in 1923, but never published. And this is a question why it was not published. However, here we have the certificate announcing that Goitein received his PhD in Frankfurt in 20th of October 1923, and afterwards, as I said earlier, the same year Goitein left Germany and sailed to the land of Israel. Now, before we go further, I will just mention that although not all materials were kept, we are lucky to have other sources of information. If one checks, for instance, the Jewish press and searches newspapers, German Jewish newspapers at the time, one can find Goitein here and there. Also in a very young age, for instance, before he was 19, he appears in the newspaper, in one of the newspapers at least, as an activist in the Young Mizrahi youth movement, and also as a teacher of Hebrew and as a leader of discussions on the problems of Judaism and of Zionism. So this, again, indeed a little bit less represented in his archive, but we have also other sources to complete this picture. So Goitein, in a very, very young age, I mean, around 18, 19, he was very active, and he was very well known in specific circles. And just one instance, here we see Rabbi Nehemiah Nobel. Rabbi Nobel was one of the most admired rabbis in Frankfurt. He was an Orthodox rabbi, but he was more open-minded through other groups within German Jewry. So Rabbi Nobel was a very charismatic figure, and he had a circle of students around him. One of them was Shlomo Dov Goitein, others were Ernst Simon and Franz Rosenzweig was also one of the figures around him, Martin Buber and others, but the younger ones again were Goitein, Simon, and a few others. And when Rabbi Nobel passed away in 1922, Goitein was chosen as the one who will write the script of on his tomb, or grave tomb. So on his grave, I mean. So Goitein, again, this is an illustration to Goitein's, let's say, activity and proximity to leading figures within Frankfurt Jewry, such as Rabbi Nehemiah Nobel, Franz Rosenzweig, with which he corresponded until Rosenzweig's death in 1928, and other alike. Now, as we said, 1923, Goitein left Germany to mandatory Palestine, and we see here a very famous figure, Gershom Scholem, and a letter from Scholem to Goitein, in Hebrew, of course, and this letter actually was written in August 1923, before they both sailed to the land of Israel, and actually they took the same boat, reached the shores of Israel in Yom Kippur 1923, Tafresh Pei Dalet, and Scholem left the boat in Jaffa, and Goitein stayed on the boat, and after a few days he reached Haifa. I think it was 2 days later, reached Haifa and settled there again for 4 years as an educator in the Reali school in Haifa. And during this time, Goitein did not precede himself, or did not direct himself to be a scholar, to be an academic, and this is why, as I said before, this is the explanation he gives to the question why he never published his PhD dissertation. However, it turned out quite soon that Goitein will not stop being a scholar, and very early in the 1920s, we see here a notebook, for instance, from 1924. It says, Reshimotai mipi mori Bahai, Bahaj Effendi. So my notes from what I wrote from my Baha'i teacher, Bahaj Effendi, Mr. Bahaj. So this is a wonderful illustration to how young Shlomo Dov Goitein, as an educator in Haifa, was using his location, Haifa, in this regard, and actually talking to local scholars, and in this case, Baha'i scholars. So Persian was the language, and Goitein also studied Persian in Frankfurt, but he was using this opportunity to improve his Persian and his knowledge about local religions, local customs, and local population in general. And you can see here a picture I took from this notebook, and really a combination of Hebrew, Persian, and sometimes here and there also German, which he was using as the language of scholarship. And this was actually a way he prepared himself, without acknowledging that, prepared himself to his future career as a scholar and academic. Again, different pictures of the same kind. Now, this could be described as field work, although he was talking, it was a kind of a field work, but as I said before, at this time, Goitein did not plan to be a professional scholar. Actually, he meant to be an educator, a teacher, and also a playwright. So here we see his first and only play, which was actually published. This play is called Pulzelina, and it deals with a woman. It deals in the Jewish community in medieval France, and a specific woman, very strong Jewish woman named Pulzelina, who was trying to defend the community from a blood libel. Eventually, she and many of the community were burned at the stake. This is a historical story. Goitein was using the historical, historical sources in order to write his play, trying to revive these medieval historical events and give it a modern closing or framing. And this is very interesting, and it's a question because Goitein was a scholar of Islam, later of Yemenite Jews of the East, of Muslim world. And here is a play about medieval France. By the way, I didn't give examples here today to that, but at this time, during the 1920s and 1930s, he was very occupied also in medieval Germany, in Ashkenaz. And for instance, during the 1930s, he was planning to write a book in German about the Hasidim of Ashkenaz medieval Hasidic movement, and eventually it did not materialize, but the letters he corresponded with the Schocken Verlag, the Schocken press in Berlin during the Nazi era, during the 1930s, are actually fascinating in this regard. So a few more later descriptions of Goitein, of his work about Pulzelina. I'm reading here. My first and only published drama was called Pulzelina, the name of a fascinating woman who died at the stake in Blois, France in 1171. It was simply the human drama embedded in history that enticed me. My plan was to write, and later describing his quite later point of time during 1927, before he joined the university. My plan was to write for the stage in the mornings and to study in the library in the afternoon and evenings. I forgot one important factor: the passion for knowledge. And as I hinted before, the passion for knowledge, the passion for scholarship, for research never left Goitein, and eventually he found his way back here. And this wonderful picture from the Hebrew University archive, we must admit. I don't know how many of you recognize the figures. I will speak only about 3 of them. So this is our, this is Goitein. Okay, so this is the library of the School of Oriental Studies during the early 1930s. To his right is Yosef Yoel Rivlin, the father of the current president of Israel, Yosef Yoel Rivlin, who later, a few years later, published his translation of the Qur'an into Hebrew, and also other very important works in the field of Arabic history and literature, and also in Judeo-Arabic field. And here, radical left, we see Levi Billig. He was a very close friend of Goitein, and maybe almost the only non-German educated scholar at this time in the School of Oriental Studies in Jerusalem, the first academic institution in this field in the land of Israel. And so Levi Billig was a close friend of Goitein, and we'll talk a little bit about him also later, or even now. So Billig quite older than Goitein, and his life story is very tragic. As you can see here, he died very young, 1936. He was actually murdered during the riots, the beginning of the riots of the Great Arab Revolt. And actually, it was a very, let's say, very tragic event. It was probably a mistake or a misidentification when he was shot down while working on his project about the Arab literature. So he was killed on his work desk, which was very, very traumatic for all his friends and fellows at the university and outside university. And what we see here, quite more optimistic, we see a letter from Goitein to Billig from 1932, describing his travel to Damascus. So at the time, scholars could go between Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and other places in the Middle East, because it was all a part of the British and French regime, and the states were not, or the borders were not set yet. So Goitein describing his journey to the library in Damascus, describing his suffering from material conditions and other things, and eventually also describing his meeting with the manager or the head of the local library, a very, very important scholar by the name of Muhammad Kurd Ali. So describing how nicely he was accepted by Kurd Ali and all that. So a very, very optimistic atmosphere described here in this letter. But Goitein himself, it must be mentioned here, Goitein himself was not very optimistic throughout his life regarding the political situation in Palestine and the land of Israel, later also the state of Israel. And he expressed his fear and his concern about the future of the state of Israel many times across the years. And we will also see some of it quite soon. But before that, a few words about his wife. He was married to Teresa Goitein, who was a musician, a dancer, a teacher of rhythmics in one of the pioneering figures in this field. They married at the beginning of 1929 and lived in today it's Ethiopia Street. Then it was called Rehov Habashim Street in Jerusalem, not far away from the place I'm here. Actually, I am in Rehavia, and this picture was taken at the day of their marriage. So we can see here Goitein and Teresa Gottlieb Goitein, the couple, the married couple, but other figures here, maybe some of you already recognize LEVI BILLIG, but here we have a very, very famous cultural hero in Israel, Shai Agnon, the Nobel laureate, who was a very, very close friend with Goitein, despite the differences of age between these two men. And here in between, we could see Hugo Bergman, also a friend and a university professor who was a very, very, at the time, he was the head of the library of what became the National Library, but later a very prominent figure at the Hebrew University. So this is from 1929. And during these years of 1920s, and we're still in the 1920s, we have to run a little bit, but I cannot skip Goitein's first encounter with the Yemenite Jews. And this is from a unique and a spatial diary, which is actually was written as a work of art during this time, mainly 1927, and this describes Goitein's first encounter with the Jews of Yemen who lived in Jerusalem. התימנים, I'm reading from here, התימנים, קהל שלם, כל הגילים, הכל משתתפים in the prayer, they all take place in the prayer, they're wearing talit also at night. And then he says something interesting. No community in Jerusalem has impressed me as they did. לא עשה עליי קהל בירושלים רושם כאלה. And then he also reflects upon it. Maybe this is due to the differences between me and them, but this impression was the very, the first step of a huge project of scholarship. Excuse me, namely Goitein's work on the culture, the language, and the social life of the Jews of Yemen. And this here you can see also only a few examples, illustrations to his work or published work. So Yemenica, scholarly book published in Germany in 1934, and at the same year, more popular, smaller book from the Juden Yemens about the Jews of Yemen, published in the Shocking series, which I mentioned before, in 1934 in Berlin. It was translated and adapted to the English readership in the 1940s and republished in 1973, and in 1983, 2 years before Goitein's death, a selection was published by the Ben Tzvi Institute here in Jerusalem, where I actually am right now. And this is a selection of some of his most prominent works about this community. And Goitein was very impressed by them, as we saw, and he actually viewed them as authentic community, which actually preserved the original Semitic dialect. And this was a very German way of thinking, but it was, at the same time, it was also a very Zionist thinking, because as a German scholar, a scholar who was educated in Germany, he was looking for the source, but at the same time, also Zionist culture, Zionist culture, was also looking for the authentic Jew, that the model of Jewish life, maybe even during the biblical times, and the Yemenites were represented something like that. Of course, it did not help them time and again when they were discriminated by some institutions and individuals, but they represented something which was very, very deep within a Zionist worldview. Another example is his publication of Habshush travels in Yemen, Masoud Habshush, and this work was played an interesting role in an unknown occasion, which I came across doing my work on this archive. Namely, one day I was working at the archive and found, told you before, I felt sometimes like a Geniza scholar. I found a bunch of crumbled pages. Look, these are some of them, and I did not understand what it's all about, but then I started reading them, and eventually I found out a fascinating, I actually discovered a fascinating and terrifying story about a father of the Yemenite community who murdered his own infant son because his son was born out of marriage, because he was his own son, but he was conceived before marriage. A long story. This father, this Yemenite poor guy or murderer, was sentenced to death. And after many efforts by many figures and institutions in the Jewish Yeshuv, Zionist Yeshuv, I'm talking about the year of 1939, he was commuted to a life sentence. But eventually, Goitein found his way into this story, into this affair, and helped him to get easier, or to have a somewhat easier punishment. And just one quote from this text, which actually was presented by Goitein to the Attorney General of the British regime: the psychological proceeding to the murder fully to be explained by the impact exercised by social belief. The murder itself was something quite exceptional, most probably committed by one who did not know what he was doing. So it's just a very short quote. If you are interested in this story, I published a year or so ago a short article about it in the blog, in the National Library blog, and hopefully a broader article will be published soon by me. So this is one example to things that come out of the archive with no expectation and surprises one with amazing stories. So during the 1930s and 40s, Goitein was also serving as a officer of education. You can see here two British official documents. This one is from 1938, and that one from 1946, which actually says this is to certify that Goitein, Dr. Goitein, is an officer of the First Division of the Palestine government and holds the appointment of senior education officer to the Jewish school of the Jewish system of education. And now, since I see Matan is pushing me to go ahead and reach the Geniza, I will just mention briefly Goitein's activities in the political sphere. Here, one letter from the famous Lebanese historian Phillip Hitti, who was considered to be one of the founders of Oriental Studies in the United States. There was a correspondence between them about questions of Zionism, about the so-called Arab question. Of course, Hitti was representing the Arab case, while Goitein was representing the Zionist case. Unfortunately, we do not have time to go inside the documents, but this is just to illustrate how scholarship was also used to promote political goals. And if we speak about political goals, so here we see another thing which blew my head when I first saw a letter from Goitein to the general manager of the Israeli Office of Foreign Affairs. It is from Budapest, 1948. And actually, Goitein in this letter actually describes his meetings taken place in sometime earlier in Paris, in a congress, during an academic conference, meeting figures such as St. John Philby, the famous British Orientalist, father of King Philby, who became also a spy, but Philby himself was a scholar, and he himself, by the way, converted to Islam, and also very deeply involved in the British diplomacy. Another person which Goitein met was Louis Massignon, the French Catholic, so-called Catholic Musulman here in this title, but was a scholar of Islam and an admirer of the Muslim world. So also French, representing the French position. And we're talking about 1948, don't forget it. And the third meeting with Taha Hussein, the famous Egyptian scholar and writer who was with whom Goitein met during this conference, and the connections between Goitein and other Israeli or Zionist scholars with Taha Hussein this is a fascinating story with which we cannot deal right now. However, at the time, excuse me for that, this visit to Budapest was also the starting point of Goitein's work on the Cairo-Geniza, and he describes in his letters home to Teresa and later also to friends, to close friends only, his encounters with documents which were kept in Budapest in the library of the rabbinical seminary in Budapest. And it was, of course, he knew about the Geniza before, but this was a starting point for his focus on the Geniza world and on writing. Eventually, he's starting to write his book about a Mediterranean society. Now, in order to be able to devote his life to scholarship, as we saw until now, he was very busy in so many fields and occupations, and he wanted to devote his life to devote more time to scholarship and specifically to the Geniza. And a very important letter he wrote to Spicer, to Avigdor Spicer in the University of Pennsylvania in 1955. I am now in a position to announce you that I accept this post of professor of Arabic in Philadelphia. In principle, I do so because I believe that for the foreseeable future, a Jewish Arabist can work for the understanding of Jews and Arabs, if at all, as a professor at a renowned American university, better than in Jerusalem. So, as we see here, two reasons for his move to the United States. First, the need for more support and more time to devote on his work with the Geniza papers. And second, what we see here, what he described as a way to somehow bridge between Jews and Arabs. This was a project in which he believed and tried to promote, but as we understand, it was not very easy to actually do that or to succeed in this bridging, because he came from a Zionist point of view, of course, and not everyone could identify with that. However, his book Jews and Arabs, which I mentioned before, is maybe his most important contribution in this direction of a combination of scholarship and also a popular endeavor to promote this idea of a proximity between Jews and Arabs, and at the same time defending the case of Israel, the Zionist case, against its opponents. So there are many examples for that. I do not want to go too deeply into these examples, but here, for instance, a letter to Professor Uriel Heyd, who actually took his place at the Hebrew University as the head of the School of Oriental Studies in Jerusalem. So here he describes a specific conference in which he presented the Zionist or the Israeli position, although this was not a conference about medieval history at all, but he found himself, he felt obligated to do that. So this is something about that. Just I read only the last sentence here. If we do not prepare a team of talented and well-educated young people and develop also a philosophy of propaganda, we will be thrown off the stage. So actually, according to Goitein, the Arab propaganda or position is represented very well in the United States, while the Israeli position is not represented at all. He saw himself as a scholar who has to do this work, and he urged Uriel Heyd to promote this direction at the Hebrew University. So, to the Geniza, or to the Mediterranean Society, his magnum opus, during his 30 years in the United States, Goitein, as I said before, became the doyen of Geniza scholarship, actually recreating the image of the Jewish medieval life in the Islamic world by his deep and let's say full of inspiration or inspirational analysis of thousands of documents from the Cairo-Geniza. And this is an amazing project, and it's also written in a way which is very easy, very inviting for also for non-scholars. This series of books, 5 books and 1 volume, which was published. I mean, he published his the first volume in 1967, and later the last volume which he wrote was published in 1988, and afterwards a 6th last volume of Index was published after his death. But he wrote these 5 volumes during his 30 years of work in the United States, in Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania, and later at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton. And actually, this is I cannot, since I'm studying that, but I'm not coming from this specific field, so I'm sure that medievalists will be able to help more in understanding this contribution. However, Goitein took the medieval Jewish history and actually presented it or introduced it to the scholarly world in general, and in this regard, his contribution to the historiography of the 20th century is one of a kind, and there are very few works which actually reached this, such a high status, and this was the price was very heavy. He had to leave the Hebrew University. He had to actually to stay at the United States, despite the fact that he did not mean initially, he meant to return after about 5 years, but it never happened because the work became broader and broader and went deeper and deeper, and eventually he finished his life at the United States. And after his death, also his one of his closest students, Professor Mordechai Akiva Friedman, who did the opposite way from the United States to the State of Israel, continued this work on the India book, on which Goitein started to work many years earlier, and eventually they also cooperated in this work, and eventually this book, it is also a series of books, was published many years after Goitein's death. Now, there is one thing which we did not speak about yet, and I hope that I have 5 minutes. Matan, please say something if you agree or disagree.
5 minutes, but no more.
Do I have another few minutes?
Yeah, a few minutes.
Okay, thank you. So we did not yet speak about maybe the most the worst event in Jewish history, and of course during the 20th century, namely the Shoah, the Holocaust. And the question which I asked myself many times during my work on Goitein's archive and on his life and his biography, why did not, it is quite difficult to find references to the Holocaust. However, I returned to the materials and I found out that actually he wrote a little bit about that and published 3 poems which deal directly with the Holocaust. But before that, during September 1939, so a few days, a week or so after the war just began, Goitein wrote in his diary thus: I believe that that man, Oto Ish, says here, Oto Ish, I believe that man will win, and under him a United States of Europe will be created. That man, of course, is Hitler. The Jews will be extinct in starvation or other means. This is inevitable because the Jews hater becomes the leader. So this prophecy of rage, this prophecy actually materialized in a way that even Goitein, which was very pessimistic, as you can see, could not even imagine, but it says something about his feelings about the future of the Jewry, of the Jews in Europe, and this feeling was accompanied him throughout this war. And only many years later, he, or at least a decade and more after that, he started to express his feelings in poems. And I will quote from only one poem, which was written in 1971 and published in 83, also in Hebrew and also in English. It was translated into English and published at the Jewish Spectator. So we read only a few passages of that. I dared, and this is, it's called Ashmoret, it's called Ashmoret Tichona, or in English, Midnight Watch. And he refers here to God. I dare to call you by name because you were familiar to me as to my forefather before me. My days and my world were filled with God. There was no need to seek. You were there. The approach was changing again and again. Commentaries ever more defined, multiplied, exoteric and esoteric, but I did not need them for keeping alive. The ancient one was there. So this was a description of the beginning, or the first phase. Now I jumped a little bit until the words became ashamed of themselves and ran away, locked themselves in and hid. And when the mouth ceased to speak, the heart stopped to ruminate. Let not his name be mentioned or remembered. It is too awesome to remember. Who dares to call the name anymore? This is midnight watch, darkness within darkness. Get up, let us gird ourselves and circle the camp. The guard must keep watch, whether he will live to see the light of day or be prey to the night. It is time to seek. So this is an unknown aspect in Goitein's life and thought, because despite the fact that he devoted almost entirely his life during his American period to scholarship, he actually never stopped thinking, reflecting, and asking questions about Judaism, about the future of Judaism, about the fate of the Jewish people and of the Jewish religion. And as we saw at the beginning of his life, he was very active in these fields back in Frankfurt during the early 20th century. Also, later in his life, later in the United States, he continued with this search, with this questioning, and was willing to find an answer. So we mentioned the Geniza, and maybe we'll have some time later to talk a little bit more. Maybe there are some questions about that. Only one quote here. The person of the Geniza in general was a man of solid ethical views. His religiosity was simple and healthy. He was remarkably realistic and free of superstitions, and usually a loyal son to his nation. The admiration of scholarship and of scholars was common and candid. And this is not only a historical statement. This is also a manifestation of Goitein's own perception of Judaism, of himself, of the ideal Jewish perspective and social approach. And one finds time and again in his work such hints to the way he saw Judaism and how he read the medieval history, Jewish history, as in light of his own perceptions during the 20th century. There's much more to think and to speak about it. I would like to conclude my talk with a quote from Professor Noam Stillman, another close friend of Goitein, in a letter from 1977. And this will be my conclusion. So he urges him not to burn his diaries. This is the context. I would like to ask you again to reconsider your intention to have your Palestine diaries destroyed. As I said to you when you told us of your decision, you were a participant in the history of our people at a time whose significance cannot be denied. Your concern for any misuse or misinterpretation of private remarks or thoughts which might appear unseemly is justified, but as a historian yourself, you cannot deny their value. You know very well the verse on Tabari, an Arab Muslim historian, that says, "You wrote history in such zeal that you have become history yourself." Although in your modesty you would deny it, we suggest that his couplet applies to yourself as well. So in this fascinating quote, I would like to finish my talk, and thank you all for listening and for your patience and for your interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hanan. I knew that 45 minutes will not be enough.
Yeah.
Even a double time. There were many interesting questions here on the chat, and I will let Doron to collect them for you and to try to answer what you can.
Doron, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Matan. Thank you very much, Dr. Harif. So the first question, I will go to Alice. I mean, you spoke about this, but she wrote, "I've always been curious why Goitein left Israel from the USA, knowing living in Israel was his goal since a young age. Maybe it's just because he offered him good opportunities. Apparently also Shai Agnon tried to discourage Goitein about the idea of leaving. Maybe you could add a little bit to that."
Yeah, so I referred to it. I will answer very shortly, very briefly. I read, I think anything one can read about that, and not only the archive of the National Library, but also the Hebrew University archive and other related archives. So Goitein did not mean to leave Israel. His plan, his goal was to live for a while, for a few years, in order to establish, to finance, and to start this project, this Geniza project. This was his idea. However, as things many times, as it happens many times, this project was not did not seem to be ending very fast. And every year again, he asked for an extension of his vacation from the university until it was impossible to go ahead, and the university said, "Well, you have to decide," and they decided to stay until this project is done. However, so I mean, the reality forced him to stay. He did not plan to leave. He meant to live for a while, for a few years, and return, but it never come true. And again, one reason was the Geniza project, and the other reason, which at least the reason which he gave to himself and to friends, and also to his new boss in the University of Pennsylvania, Spicer, was that he felt that he had to do this work of bridging or to representing the Israeli position versus attacks within American Academy. So maybe it was only a kind of a wishful thinking. Maybe it was an excuse, but actually he did that, or he tried to do that. So this was a combination of these two reasons was there, and of these two motives, and this is what happened eventually. It did not just, one day left Israel for the United States. Yeah, I hope I answered the question well.
Thank you very much. Marsha asked, did Goitein burn the diaries or not in the end?
Well, fortunately, we are lucky. He did not burn them. He left them. They were kept in his archive. And thanks to that, we know so much about his life, about his thought. And I'm very thankful to my friend Noam Stillman, Professor Noam Stillman, for arguing against this decision, and they were not burned. And yeah, and also the family, the Goitein family was generous enough to donate all his archive, including the diaries, to donate them to the National Library. And Matan remembers about 5 or 6 or so years ago his visit to Elon Goitein's home, and also later together we went to Ayala, his oldest daughter, and they gave us everything, and we are very, very thankful for them for that.
Thank you very much. Jerome had quite a few questions. The first one is, he wrote, I remember hearing Goitein speak when I was a teenager, and he received the Levi Gershon de la Vida Medal at UCLA, great intellect. He wrote an article in Tarbiz, and he writes on, but then the question is, does the library have the medal?
Well, I remember the pictures of these medals, and I think that at least some of them do exist in the archive. Matan, maybe you remember also. I think they are there. I'm almost sure that the medals are there. I remember that. I have pictures of them. I, for some reason, did not bring them here today, the pictures, but I'm quite sure that the certificates on all the prizes, the medals and stuff like that are kept in the archive. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Just a wonderful comment here by Ellen. She writes, extraordinary. I loved him like a grandfather.
Wow.
And there's a question by Judy. It's very specific, and she asks, did Shlomo study Isaiah? Did he have any comments on Isaiah 7:14 and Isaiah 53?
Well, I must admit I don't remember the specific chapters on which he commented, and maybe you have to check. I mean, there's one book which Goitein published, which is a biblical research, and it's in Hebrew, and it's called Iyunim Bamikra, and there you can find the selection of his papers about it. There's also his bibliography. I told you about 800 items. I have it here, and I can check that. But of course not right now. I'm not sure regarding specific chapters and verses, but you can check that. It's not that of a problem.
Thank you very much. Jerome had another question. Which yeshiva in Frankfurt did he go to?
Well, this is an interesting question, because Goitein was actually not a yeshiva boy or yeshiva student. He arrived at Frankfurt in 1914, studied in the local gymnasium, and then after he finished gymnasium and joined the army for half a year, as I said, after he was released from the army, he right away joined the Goethe Universität, so the University of Frankfurt, but at the same time he was studying with specific figures. I mentioned Rabbi Nobel. There was also very important figure in his own education, Rabbi Posen. So they were all kind of, it was all not an institutional connection. It was not registered in a yeshiva. He was taking classes and studying Chavruta with many Talmudic scholars. There's another friend, more or less of his own age, Nahum Glatzer, which actually eventually moved to the United States, and he became a professor and a scholar and a writer and publisher. So Nahum Glatzer was a chavruta of Goitein, and there's pictures of them together studying Talmud. So it was not a yeshiva, it was not registered in a yeshiva, but just taking part in this intellectual, religious atmosphere, which actually influenced his life, influenced his visions throughout his life.
Thank you very much. Jerome asked another question here. What was the failed project in Budapest?
The what again? The failed project. Okay. So this is a long story. For obvious reasons, I could mention only very briefly. So there was what I already spoke about, his meetings with scholars and diplomatic activists such as Massignon and Philby, and Arab scholars such as Taha Hussein and others. So this was one thing. This took place not in Budapest, but in Paris. Then he reached Budapest. In Budapest, he was working also as an officer of education, but this time not for the British education, because it was after the establishment of Israel, but he was representing the university in a so-called Association of Jewish Education Abroad. So this was an organization which tried to somehow to control or to direct in one way or another Jewish education in Europe, also in place like Hungary, which was, as you know, already becoming or submitted to the communist regime. However, there was another project or mission, and this was to bring manuscripts and books from the library of the rabbinical seminary in Budapest, and it was a part of a huge project called Otzvot HaGola, the collection of the treasures of the Gola. Sholem, his friend, was very busy in the same project a few years earlier in Germany, and much was written about it. And Goitein was also trying to reach these treasures in order to save them from the Bolshevist authorities. I think this was the project which failed. He did not return with any treasures from there.
Thank you very much. Barry wrote, I was under the impression that at least some of his archive is at Princeton. Is that true?
Well, this is a question, and his private archive in full is in Jerusalem. His Yemen so-called, after his death, the family was just moved the materials, the private materials, to Jerusalem, and then afterwards gave them to the library, to the National Library. Now, his so-called Yemenite archive, which I did not talk about today, is here in Yad Ben Tzvi, Machon Ben Tzvi. He gave the whole scholarly archive of his work with the Yemenites. He gave it to Machon Ben Tzvi because this is the place of research about Oriental Jews or Jews of the Oriental world, and so on and so forth. In Princeton, there is the so-called Geniza lab. So it is not an archive. It is a so-called lab. It is a collection of thousands, maybe more, of a Geniza of photos of Geniza papers. And nowadays, for years already, it's been digitized and it's online. And thanks to the people there, scholars in Princeton and in the institute, which are very, very concerned about, very devoted to this project. Maybe some other papers were left in Princeton, but if they were, I tried to get a clear notion of that, and as far as I know, there's not much archival materials left in Princeton, but maybe there is something, but not something essential, most probably.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Harif. There are many compliments and thank yous in the chat room.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Barry has another question. In any case, I'm going to open the microphone so that people can say thank you personally and ask any more questions that anybody has left over. Thank you all for being with us. Thank you again, Dr. Harif, and I'll see you all in our next event.
Thank you, Doron. I would just mention, I see a question about the cards of his research on the Mediterranean society. So the cards themselves are still at the National Library, cards, which he wore. I mean, it's amazing. I will give you one example. It's not from Goitein, but something similar. So about 20 or 30 bigger boxes, and with such cards and with translations, transcriptions. This specific box is from his colleague and later rival, Professor Eliyahu Ashtor, which is a fascinating story by himself. And this is a part of his archive here in Yad Ben Tzvi, in his way there. This box, I mean, but so the cards themselves are at the National Library, but they are all scanned, and I think, I'm not sure if all of them, but some of these are scanned in this Geniza project of Princeton, and again, the photos of Geniza papers themselves are all digitized.
Thank you, Hanan. Before anyone else involved, I must say personally that it is really exciting to see here in the audience people who met Goitein personally and had the opportunity to speak to him and to hear him lecturing. Hanan and I didn't have this opportunity, and people in our age didn't, but I think for sure that Hanan, as one who worked on his personal archive for quite a long time, knows him quite well. And as I can say, say for sure that when you work on a personal archive, you get to know the one you're working on pretty well, even better than his family and
sometimes in specific aspects.
So it is really exciting to see here people who met him. And
I see here Aviva Klein-Franke, which was a student of Goitein, and she and her late husband were working with him on the Yemenite culture and history. For me, it's quite exciting seeing you, Aviva. So thank you for being here.
Thank you all once more. The microphones are open.
I have a question. How many assistants did Professor Goitein had?
How many assistants during his
yeah, because you know his work is huge.
Right. Yeah. I understand the question.
Cover everything in one, Baron as well,
Yeah. I understand the question. So he did not have many of them, but there were all the time. There were a few, and it's a story upon which I could not reflect today at all. But it's a fascinating story, and some of his assistants were Israeli young scholars, like PhD students. Some were Americans, such as I mentioned, Noam Stillman, his late wife Yedida Stillman, and Mordechai Akiva Friedman, of course, and others. But there were also others, very, very important or very interesting story, a scholar by the name of Murad Michael, who was only 10 years or so younger than Goitein. He was born in Iraq. He was a poet. He was a very interesting figure himself, and he was also working on the Geniza. And these students were doing their own research, but this research, many times, it was a part of the German way to do things, to do research, I think. So the professor gives specific parts of the huge project, gives specific students a specific mission, and then he also can use his students' work as a way to promote or to advance the general project. So he had here and there, but not many. So I think at the time, I think he had one or two at most. And of course, there were also the PhD students who wrote their own research, and they helped him in specific fields. talking about his Yemenite research, it's a quite different story. And there he had also so-called informants. So Yemenites who were working as interviewers and as scientific helpers going across the country, across Israel, and interviewing people, meeting them, and helping him with that. There's much to talk about it, but it's quite, it's quite a big story. So it was also a part of his earlier work with the Yemenite Jews. Any more questions or comments?
Yeah. Would you spend a few words about his historiography versus Lewis, versus other people who work in the field, versus even Cohen,
Mark Cohen,
the chancellor. Mark Cohen is younger, but
yeah.
Cohen, the chancellor, JTS chancellor, also was much into Muslim, Jews under Muslim.
Yeah,
the one who wrote Kabbalah, Kabbalah.
You mean
No,
Sholem? Gershom Sholem?
Gershom Cohen.
There was okay. So it's a big, very wide question. I will say just a few words. So first of all, Goitein was in very good contact with many scholars, and it's also a part of his enormous success. His American archive, so-called, is the archive of his letters from 57 or 58 until 85. It's organized. There are thousands of letters with hundreds of scholars across the world, from the United States, Israel, India, Pakistan, Tunisia, Egypt, and Europe, you name it. And this was a part of Goitein's way of work. He was a networker, so he was cooperating with many people, and specifically Bernard Louis was a close, so he was quite younger than Goitein, but they cooperated, although their focus was quite different, but there was a friendship, there was connections. It is quite hard now to do the analysis or to do the comparison between specific scholarship or different scholarships to that matter. But yeah, so this Goitein was also not afraid of mistakes and of arguments, also of agreements. So if he did not have any problem to correspond with someone and change his own mind, or to ask him to reconsider his or her conclusions. So this is a part of, I think, a scholar. I mean, for us all, I think it's an important lesson to learn not to be afraid to share the knowledge, not to be afraid of mistakes, just to be brave enough and admit when one does mistake, so you can change and write differently, and not just being open to everyone who has something to contribute and to share in his or her work. So I think this is also something that everyone, every scholar and every person could learn from Goitein's work. You mentioned Sholem, so Sholem.
I didn't mention Sholem. I mentioned Gershom Cohen.
Yeah, there was Gershom Cohen, who was a historian, and they corresponded quite a bit. But I'm not sure that, I mean, since their fields were not quite the same, right? Since their fields were not quite the same, I think there was respect between Gershom Cohen and Goitein. They were correspondents. They shared ideas and thoughts, but I do not think I can give right now. At least I can check that, of course, anything clear about differences or different approaches of these two figures. Yeah.
Intelligent people recognize their mistakes. There's no doubt.
Yeah.
My question was about their understanding of Jewish history. It was
okay. Yeah. So this is a
geographical perspective. Of course, we learn from everybody, especially when you have such level of chokhmah, and so forth.
Yeah.
That was not the question, but it's okay. You don't have time, and
there's no time. I will say one thing. I will not speak about Gershon Cohen. Because I'm not an expert on his.
No, about him.
About Goitein, I can say. I will say one thing about Goitein. It is important. Goitein found himself, and it has to do also with the previous questions. Goitein found himself in opposition to the so-called Jerusalem School of Historiography. And this is a very important point here. Because Goitein, as a scholar, he was a part of the Hebrew University. So he was a very, very prominent figure there. He was the head of the School of Oriental Studies for 8 years between 1950, 49-50, until 57, and he was a part of that. And he also was very, very busy, not only in Islamic and Arab history, but of course in Jewish history. So on the one hand, he was part of that. However, when he published his A Mediterranean Society, not everyone here in Jerusalem were very happy with his approach, and it was not anti-Zionist in any way, but the way that he described the life of the Jews in medieval Mediterranean basin, and this society, a society of open to local culture, to very good, very deep connections to the Muslim and other communities. This description was not very, let's say, was not very well accepted by everyone. Not everyone, but some scholars here in Jerusalem were not very happy about this change of focus within Jewish history to a history which is very, very, in a way, diasporic history. Okay, and in this regard, Goitein was a groundbreaking scholar. Also in that regard, because today, talking about Jewish history as a diasporic history is, old news. But at the time, it was still a question, and the Zionist approach, Zionist ideology, very deeply, very heavily influenced also some, not all, but some of the scholars. And in this regard, Goitein's historical approach and his approach to this classic, so-called classic Geniza period of between 10th and around 13th centuries in North Africa, in Spain, in Egypt, of course, in India, and across this line was something at the time quite surprising, and it changed a lot. It changed historiography and Jewish historiography specifically in a very, very meaningful way. So this is about something regarding Goitein's historical perception.
I have a question about correspondence. Did he have any correspondence with Salo Baron or with Philip Brodel?
Yeah, of course.
Especially.
Yeah, both. So he corresponded with both of them. I told you, he was a networker, so he was corresponding with everyone. His correspondence with Baron were earlier, already in the late 40s, or at least 1950. He actually came, his first visit to the United States took place in 1951, and he was giving lectures and representing the Hebrew University in various conferences and occasions. So he corresponded with Baron, and I can identify some connection, some influence maybe of Baron, or at least Baron's diasporic, by the way, talking about diasporic history. So there is something of Baron's social approach to and communal approach to history found its way to Goitein's view of Jewish history in the Geniza period and around across the Mediterranean. This is regarding Baron. Regarding Brodel, of course, it's a great question. So Goitein writing about the Mediterranean society, a Mediterranean society, and Brodel writing about the Mediterranean itself. So a scholar, there is scholarship about it, and at least 2 articles written by Professor Peter Miller of I think Bard College, who actually describes the connections between Goitein and Clement Heller, who was Baron's let's say organizer or deputy or whatever, the technical the more administrative person in Brodel's institution in Paris. And these papers are mainly based on the correspondence between Goitein and this institution, and there's 1 or 2, maybe only letters with Brodel himself. Goitein, by the way, reflected upon that at afterwards of his Mediterranean Society in the 5th volume, and I recommend everyone who has any interest in his approach to Brodel to read that, because he actually tries to say, well, yeah, I heard about Brodel, but it did not actually influence me that much, and I read it too late, stuff like that. So Peter Miller is a bit skeptic about that. And however, I can say that Goitein's personal archive and some papers which exist here and do not exist in Paris gives some further information and different aspects to this story of the connections, because Brodel offered Goitein to write his book with him, or not with him, but under his institution, and did not materialize. The question is why it did not happen, and this is a long story. And I do urge you, if you are any interested in these questions, so read Peter Miller's papers and also my own to be published references to that.
And what about Yosef Klausner? Did they have a collegial relationship?
I'm sorry, we have no more time. I apologize. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Hanan Harif, once more. I'm sorry, Jerome, but maybe Dr. Harif can give you his email, and you can.
No problem. I will. Yeah, I can give my email. No problem. So, do you want to be the mediator between us?
Absolutely. I'll put it in the chat right now, and
thank you.
Sure. Thank you all. Thank you all for being here once more.
And have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, the email is in the chat room, and thank you all once more, and Laila Tov from Jerusalem.